In 1988, Viktor believed he had won the game of life. As a senior aerospace engineer in the heart of the Soviet Union, his world was defined by a quiet, rhythmic certainty. He lived in a spacious, sunlit apartment in a prestigious district of Moscow, a reward for decades spent perfecting the guidance systems of rockets that touch the stars. To Viktor, and to millions like him, wealth wasn't a fluctuating number on a screen. It was the weight of his Soviet savings bank book and the guaranteed delivery of his monthly pension. The ruble was more than just currency. It was the physical manifestation of a superpower's promise. Every Saturday, Viktor would drive his modest Lada out of the gray concrete sprawl of the city and into the deep green of the Russian countryside. He was heading to his Dacha, a small 600-square-meter plot of land granted to him by the ministry. Back then, the Dacha was a symbol of leisure, a modest perk for the loyal worker. It was a place to drink tea under the birch trees, to paint a wooden fence, and perhaps grow a few decorative roses or a handful of strawberries to impress the neighbors. It was a hobby, a weekend escape from the rigors of high science.
Across the Soviet Union, these tiny patches of dirt were viewed with a sort of sentimental detachment. They were non-productive assets in the eyes of the state's grand economic planners. No one looked at a dacha and saw a life raft. Why would they? The grocery stores, while sometimes meager, were functional. The state-run bakeries always had bread. The heating in Viktor's city apartment hummed with a subsidized warmth that felt as permanent as the sun. In this era of the Great Illusion, the most dangerous thing you could own was a sense of security. Viktor felt rich because he played by the rules. He had saved nearly 30,000 rubles, enough in 1988 to buy several luxury cars or a small villa. He kept that money in the state bank, trusting the institution that had survived world wars and revolutions. He didn't buy gold, he didn't hoard supplies, he believed in the system's permanence. He watched the evening news, saw the reports of perestroika and restructuring, and felt a sense of optimistic curiosity. He didn't realize that the foundation of his world was not made of stone, but of drying ink on a failing contract. He was standing on the deck of a ship that was already underwater, admiring the view of the horizon.
By 1991, the rhythmic certainty of Viktor's life didn't just stumble, it shattered. The Soviet Union, an entity that had seemed as eternal as the mountains, ceased to exist on a Tuesday. At first, the change felt academic, a matter of flags and speeches, but then the shock therapy began. The new government, desperate to pivot to a market economy overnight, lifted price controls. In a blink, the invisible hand of the market became a fist. The first crack appeared at the local grocery store. Viktor watched as the price of a single loaf of bread rose every hour. He went to the bank to withdraw his 30,000 rubles, his lifetime of labor, his daughter's future, only to find the doors chained. The state bank, once the ultimate guarantor of safety, had declared a liquidity holiday. When the doors finally opened, the math had changed. Hyperinflation had arrived like a silent thief. Those 30,000 rubles, which could once have purchased a fleet of cars, were now barely enough to buy a week's worth of eggs. His wealth hadn't been stolen, it had simply evaporated, leaving behind the ghost of a numbers in a passbook. Viktor returned to his prestigious research facility, but the guidance systems he designed were now irrelevant to a nation that couldn't afford milk. His salary was paid in coupons, or delayed for months. He saw his colleagues, men with PhDs in physics and chemistry, standing on street corners in their best suits, selling their personal libraries, their winter coats, and even their wedding rings just to buy a bag of flour. The systemic illusion had vanished. The ruble was no longer a medium of exchange. It was a hot potato that everyone tried to get rid of the moment they touched it. people stopped looking at the TV for news and started looking at their pantries. The just-in-time supply chains of the Soviet cities, built on the assumption of a functioning currency, collapsed. Trucks stopped moving because diesel cost more than the cargo was worth. The shelves stayed empty. In the heart of the world's largest nation, a terrifying realization set in. Paper cannot be eaten, and status cannot be traded for calories. The urban elite, the intellectuals, and the workers were all equal now. They were all starving. Viktor's transformation from a man of science to a man of the soil was not a choice. It was an act of biological desperation. By the winter of 1992, the central heating in his prestigious apartment flickered and died. The Panelka concrete walls, once a symbol of modern comfort, became a cold tomb. He realized that the city was a trap, a high-density cage where millions of people waited for a supply chain that was no longer coming. He packed a single rucksack and took the train to his dacha. The suburban stations were scenes of quiet chaos, filled with gray-faced professors and factory workers clutching rusted shovels and bags of sprouting seeds. When he arrived at his 600 square meters of dirt, the rose bushes he had once tended for leisure were long dead. In their place, he began to dig. This was the brutal reality of the dacha economy. While the nation's GDP plummeted and the international media focused on the rise of the billionaire oligarchs, 30 million Russian families were treated to these tiny plots. Viktor's day began at 4 in the morning. He wasn't calculating rocket trajectories anymore. He was calculating the caloric density of a potato. He learned the hard math of survival, that 1 hectare of potatoes could feed a family, but his 600 meters required perfect efficiency. He used human waste as fertilizer because chemicals were non-existent. He spent his afternoons weeding with fingers that were once used to calibrate laser optics. The dacha became a fortress. In the city, a man with a gold watch was a target for thieves. At the dacha, a man with a surplus bag of onions was a king. Viktor witnessed the birth of the gray market. He traded a hand-carved wooden stool for a liter of kerosene. He traded extra cabbage for basic antibiotics. There was no gold, no silver, and certainly no rubles involved. The economy had stripped away its sophisticated mask and returned to its primal state, a direct exchange of life-sustaining goods. The most chilling part of this reality was the silence of the state. The government didn't help, but they didn't interfere either. They knew that the dacha was the only thing preventing a total revolution. These tiny plots of land were the shadow welfare state. Viktor, the man who once lived for the future of Soviet spaceflight, now lived entirely for the next harvest. He was exhausted. His hands were permanently stained with soil, and he had lost 20 pounds. But for the first time in years, his family was eating. The collapse of the Soviet Union eventually stabilized, but the world Viktor returned to was unrecognizable. By the late 1990s, the new Russians were driving armored Mercedes through the streets of Moscow. But the middle class that Viktor once belonged to had been hollowed out. Their lifetime of labor transferred into the pockets of a few through the alchemy of hyperinflation and corrupt privatization. Yet, as the smoke cleared, a startling economic truth emerged. During the worst years of the crash, these tiny, unproductive dacha plots, occupying less than 3% of Russia's total agricultural land, had produced over 50% of the nation's meat and 80% of its vegetables and potatoes. It was the greatest decentralized insurance policy in human history. The dacha hadn't just beaten the ruble, it had rendered the ruble irrelevant when it mattered most. The historical lesson for the modern viewer is both somber and urgent. We live in an era of unprecedented financial abstraction. We store our wealth in digital ledgers, in fiat currencies backed by debt, and in just-in-time stock markets that assume the grocery store shelves will always be restocked by morning. We have traded resilience for efficiency. Viktor's story teaches us that in a systemic collapse, the liquidity of an asset is measured by how quickly it can be turned into a meal.
Wealth preservation is often discussed in terms of gold, silver, or Bitcoin, but the Russian collapse proves that the ultimate hedge is a productive asset. Gold cannot be eaten, and a digital wallet cannot grow a cabbage. True security lies in the ability to produce a necessity that the world cannot live without, whether that is food, energy, or a tangible skill. Viktor eventually retired, but he never gave up his dacha. He kept the soil rich and the seeds sorted. He knew a secret that the bankers in the high-rises had forgotten, that the economy is a fragile story we tell ourselves, but the land is the truth. When the story ends and the ink on the contracts fades, you are left with only what you can hold in your hands and what you can grow from the earth. The next crisis may not look like 1991, but the math of survival remains unchanged. The most valuable thing you own is not what you have in the bank. It's what you can do when the bank is gone.